You know, when you look at Bolivia from the outside, it's pretty easy to just see a modern history defined by political turmoil, economic crises, and intense social conflict. But honestly, viewing Bolivia as just some country prone to random instability completely misses the mark. Today, we're diving into an explainer of Bolivia's 3,000-year history, and we're going to see it for what it truly is, a fascinating, relentless cycle of dramatic upheaval and profound rebirth. We're tracing the lines straight from ancient empires to modern political experiments so we can finally understand the heartbeat of this incredible nation. Let's get right into it.
So to really grasp what drives Bolivia, we absolutely have to look through the lens of this ancient Andean concept called Pachacuti. It's essentially a cyclic time marker. But it's not just a fancy word for change, right? It describes a time of profound reconstruction, renewal, and deep societal upheaval. Think of it like a constant pendulum swing. As we go through this, you'll see how Bolivia's history isn't just a straight line. Nope, it's a series of Pachacutis, moments where old worlds are violently overturned and entirely new ones are born right from the ashes.
Okay, so this cycle kicks off around 500 CE. Back then, the region was dominated by the Tiwanaku Empire. These guys were an incredible Aymara civilization of philosophers and astronomers, building these massive megalithic temples near Lake Titicaca. Fast forward a bit to around 1472, and boom, the first major Pachacuti hits. The expanding Inca Empire sweeps in, conquering the region and imposing their own language and strict new hierarchies. But you know, the Inca rule actually lasted less than a century there. Because in 1532, Francisco Pizarro and his Spanish expedition show up. They took full advantage of a brutal Inca civil war, absolutely crushed the existing structures, and plunged the whole region into a completely new colonial era.
Now, the Spanish colonial era brought in a stark, frankly brutal reality. From the legendary Cerro Rico in Potosi, literally translating to the Rich Mountain, the Spanish extracted an estimated 200 million pesos in gold and silver. I mean, that is immense wealth. That quite literally funded the Spanish Empire and fueled the European Renaissance. But, and this is absolutely crucial, that wealth came at a devastating cost. The colonial administration basically viewed the indigenous population as nothing more than exploitable labor. Well, actually scratch that. It was worse than just labor. Over half the population was decimated by forced work, disease, and incredibly harsh treatment. This established a deep racial and economic hierarchy that ended up marginalizing indigenous Bolivians for centuries.
So what does this all mean for when Bolivia finally broke free from Spain? Well, in 1825, the country achieved independence and was named after the liberator himself, Simón Bolívar. But here's the catch. For the vast majority of the population, this wasn't a liberation at all. Independence was really just an administrative shift. The brand new republic was controlled by a small, white, Creole elite who just maintained the exact same colonial hierarchies. The indigenous majority were totally excluded from political power, denied civil rights, and their communal lands were heavily exploited. They saw almost zero change in their day-to-day lives, which, as you can imagine, planted some deep, deep seeds for future friction. And that internal friction, it was very quickly compounded by some devastating external disasters. During the War of the Pacific, Bolivia suffered the massive loss of its sea access to Chile. That's a wound that still defines Bolivian foreign policy today, for sure. Then they lost the rubber-rich Acre region to Brazil, which was followed by the absolutely disastrous Chaco War against Paraguay in the 1930s. That one resulted in huge casualties and even more lost land. These catastrophic losses stripped Bolivia of vital resources, left the country totally landlocked, and fueled this deep collective national trauma. It basically set the stage for total domestic political chaos.
Which brings us right into the incredibly tumultuous 20th century. One source puts it perfectly, noting that Bolivia was gripped in a cyclical chain of increasingly severe political and economic crises. The country was being pushed straight toward a breaking point. You have the loss of territory, combined with the country's heavy reliance on a highly volatile global tin market, making the status quo just completely unsustainable. Traditional elites were losing their grip, labor movements were actively organizing in the mines, and the masses were demanding inclusion. Another Pachacuti was, without a doubt, inevitable.
And the pendulum finally swung back with the monumental 1952 revolution, which completely transformed the country. The National Revolutionary Movement, or MNR, seized power and hit the ground running with radical changes. First off, universal suffrage, finally giving the indigenous and peasant majority the right to vote. They also nationalized the massive tin mines, breaking the economic stranglehold of the oligarchs, and enacted this sweeping agrarian reform to redistribute land. It was a massive, ambitious attempt to integrate the excluded masses and build a modern nation-state. But while it definitely shattered the old order, it ultimately failed to create any sort of lasting political or economic equilibrium.
To really understand the sheer chaos that followed,
I want you to consider this staggering number, 21. That is the number of presidents Bolivia had in just the 36 years following the 1952 revolution. And get this, half of those 21 presidents lasted in office for less than a single year. No way, right? It was a constant revolving door of right-wing military coups, brief populist swings, authoritarian crackdowns, and literal street fighting. Basically, no government could manage to achieve both legitimacy with the people and authority over the military at the same time.
And hey, if political instability wasn't enough for you, inflation hit a mind-boggling 4,000% a month during the devastating economic crisis of 1984 to 1985. That is one of the most dramatic hyperinflations in world history, not caused by a war. Prices were rising faster than the government could physically print the money. To put that into perspective, things got so incredibly bad and the currency became so utterly worthless that citizens were actually better off investing their cash in cartons of cigarettes than in government bonds.
So how on earth did they stop the bleeding? Well, in the late 1980s and 90s, the government brought in strict neoliberal structural adjustments. And strictly speaking, it worked to stabilize the macroeconomy and crush that inflation. But there was a massive social cost. These policies ended up concentrating wealth right at the very top and relied heavily on privatizing state assets. So once again, the indigenous and working class majority found themselves economically excluded and totally marginalized. Naturally, grassroots social movements began organizing, demanding an end to what they saw as centuries of neo-colonialism. The stage was officially set for the next great Pachacuti.
Section 2. The Plurinational Experiment, Reclaiming Identity and Power.
In 2005, a brand new era officially kicked off. Evo Morales, a former coca grower union leader, pulled off a stunning electoral victory with 54% of the vote. He successfully channeled all that anti-colonial and anti-neoliberal frustration of the masses to completely dismantle the old political establishment. When he entered office in 2006, Morales became Bolivia's first indigenous president since the Spanish conquest over 400 years prior. Talk about a real game changer. It was an absolute watershed moment for a country where the vast majority of the population had been historically locked out of power. When you realize that over 62% of Bolivia's population identifies as indigenous, the cultural weight of this election becomes truly monumental. Recognizing this reality, Morales and the social movements pushed hard for a radical constitutional rewrite. In 2009, a new constitution officially transformed Bolivia from a traditional republic into a plurinational state. And listen, this wasn't just a simple name change. It was a profound legal and cultural recognition that Bolivia is actually made up of 36 to 50 distinct indigenous nations, each with their very own identities, languages, and rights to self-determination. This plurinational constitution established a completely new national framework. It introduced 37 official languages and officially recognized traditional indigenous justice systems as being entirely equal to the ordinary state courts. On the economic side, the state reclaimed control over key industries, particularly by nationalizing the super lucrative natural gas sector. And the revenue generated from this massive gas boom, it was funneled directly into pro-poor resource transfers and social programs specifically aimed at lifting the historically marginalized right out of poverty. Now, as the sources point out, this era is really defined by a deep paradox. On one hand, the achievements are undeniable. The government drastically reduced poverty and inequality, and indigenous representation in public life reached unprecedented levels. However, the critiques from the other side are equally significant. Critics highlight that the government funded all these social programs by relying heavily on extractivist policies, mining and drilling, that ended up causing severe environmental damage to indigenous lands. Plus, many social movements argue that the whole process led to elite capture, where a new neo-colonial elite basically just replaced the old one, concentrating wealth and power right back at the top. Which brings us to the ongoing friction we see today. Bolivia's constitution famously recognizes the rights of Mother Earth, but at the exact same time, the state desperately needs revenue to survive. The government faces this immense, sometimes violent challenge. They have to balance the constitutional promises of autonomy made to indigenous communities in the Amazon and Altiplano against the relentless economic demand to extract gas, minerals, and resources from those exact same territories. It's a massive clash between the ideals of decolonization and the harsh realities of global economics. All of this leaves us with one final, absolutely vital question. Has Bolivia's radical plurinational experiment finally created a framework for lasting inclusion and peace? Or, given the deep divisions, environmental conflicts, and political disputes that are still persisting today, are we simply witnessing the latest turn in Bolivia's endless cycle?
Take a close look at the history we've just uncovered and ask yourself, is the next Pachacuti already underway?